you see something that shocks you, amazes you, maybe doesn't sound completely right, or is that true? Then go do the research. Don't just hit share, don't just hit send, but look and see, well, maybe that may not be entirely true. And then go get the other side. And probably what you're going to find out is that there's a kernel of truth to both sides. And the actual truth, the actual fact is probably somewhere in between.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Framework Leadership, where we talk with leaders from across the globe and explore their leadership techniques and strategies for guiding their organizations to achieve success. I'm your host, Ken Engel, president of Southeastern University.
And I'm your co-host, Michael Steiner, Senior Vice President for Advancement and Innovation.
And we're excited today to introduce our guest for the show, Marc Lotter. Marc currently serves as the Chief Communications Officer at America First Policy Institute. He has held pivotal roles, including Press Secretary for Vice President Pence, Director of Strategic Communications for the Trump-Pence 2020 campaign, and Special Assistant to the President. Marc also has a rich background in state government and local television, where his work earned 2 Emmy Awards. Marc, it's great to have you on the show today.
No, thanks for having me.
Yeah, a privilege. Now, having worked in both the state government, federal government, having worked at the White House, what have you discovered in those various leadership dynamics? What have you learned through those things? What core leadership principles have guided you through these roles, and what's kept you dedicated and resilient in the process?
Well, I think one of the things that I've learned, especially when I served with former Indiana Governor Mitch Daniels, who was also the president of Purdue University later on, and then with the mayor of Indianapolis, Greg Ballard, they always viewed their greatest legacy as leaders were not going to be a policy, not going to be a balanced budget, not going to be some building that they built and they oversaw. It was the next generation of leaders that learned as young people under them and what they went on to achieve later in life. And so all the great leaders I have ever worked with have expected the people who work under them to actually do better than they do.
Wow.
And they set a pretty high bar. And so they expect us and they hope that we will deliver.
Yeah. And so, with these situations, I feel like we're in a very similar time frame in American society, right? Where there's a massive generational growth and change in both parties across the board. How do you see that kind of playing out? And what do you think is kind of the legacy of past leadership that we're seeing on this upcoming generation?
Well, to a certain extent, I don't really see that much of a change. Okay. How we communicate is changed, and what we're highlighting has changed. But when it comes to, at least like for the America First Policy Institute, the same things that Ronald Reagan was fighting for back in 1980, we still fight for today. Lower taxes, less regulation, peace through strength. Those are the same hallmarks that Ronald Reagan obviously famously made, and it's the same things we fight for today. We communicate differently, and we communicate with people differently. But I think those bedrock principles have really remained unchanged, at least for our side, for at least the last 40, 50 years.
I love it.
Yeah. Your career experience spans not only politics, but of course, media and public service. You were actually a television reporter, something we have in common. And you also spent 13 years as a producer manager for television stations across the country. What did you learn throughout your broadcast career and media field that helped you, set you up for your press and advisory roles, especially in the White House?
Well, I think the number one thing that I learned as both on air and then off air as a writer and producer was that you have to speak to people in a way that they can understand it. Your job is to basically translate some very difficult concepts, some very difficult situations, but communicate it in a way that it resonates with the people back at home who are watching, who don't follow the news of the day or the events that you may be covering on a daily basis. You have to make it in a way where they can grasp the gravity of the situation or what's going on. And so whether that's at the White House, whether that's in my role outside, or whether it was when I was working for state and local politicians, the key is to talk to your viewers, your customers, ultimately your voters, your neighbors, your constituents, in a way where they can understand some of the very complex and detailed things that you are trying to get across.
So what are some of the principles you've discovered from your career to make that translation, to get those things? I mean, obviously, you've addressed not just polarized conversations and topics, but also very complex ones. So how do you get that across? What are some of the principles that you've learned that leaders can take away when they're making that same kind of communication?
Well, first we have to understand that while yes, the viewers, the constituents whom you're speaking with are very smart in their own right, you probably know more about the situation than they do. And that's what they're counting on you to do. So you've got to cover not just the basics, but also bring them along with you. One of the key things I think and I look at, whether I'm speaking on television or if I'm in front of a live audience or writing for someone else to speak, if I can get people nodding with me, nodding their head up and down, it shows that they are understanding, they're grasping what it is that we're telling them. And so then once I get them nodding into agreement, I can build with the next step or the next piece of information. But we have to stop assuming that people, and I think that's one of the biggest mistakes people make, is we immediately assume that everyone knows what we're talking about because we happen to be saying it.
Yeah.
So good. So good. And so, I think in some of that too, you communicate and then you get some criticism back, right? That's one of the things that a lot of leaders, and you've been in many situations where you've seen some incredible leaders get really intense criticism. So what are the principles you found that help you kind of thrive through that, keep pushing through that? And how can leaders really step into those kind of situations?
Well, I think first off, criticism, we don't need to look at it as a negative. We should look at it as a positive. One of the big takeaways that I take from both my time with Indianapolis Mayor Ballard at the time, Governor Daniels, and even President Trump, where they surrounded themselves with people who didn't agree. And a lot of times, especially we see some leaders surround themselves with people who all think the same thing. But when we can understand the other side, when we know the arguments that are going to come from the other side, or as a former journalist, when I take it upon myself to make sure I understand the other side, not only can I prepare my argument against that side, or I might actually see they may have something to some of the things that they're saying. And if we can incorporate a few tweaks here and there, we can actually have something where everyone is nodding in agreement with us.
I love it.
Yeah. Now, from your perspective, how has political communication evolved in the era of social media? And what do you see as the biggest communication challenges that campaigns will face in this upcoming election, especially with the rise of social media and so much misinformation and right out lying, actually, on different positions?
Well, unfortunately, I see our media, our mainstream media, de-evolving back to where they came from. A lot of people don't remember that in the early days of our country, the media were partisan. The newspapers of the time were operated as partisan entities because the only way they could actually make money is if they got the government printing contract after their preferred candidates were elected to office. In my home state of Indiana, we actually have some vestiges of that. There is a newspaper to this day that is still called the Rushville Republican, and there's one called the Corridon Democrat. Now, that's not the partisan leanings of those papers, but it's still in their banner. And what we are seeing now is, I think, a de-evolution where you're seeing the media play a partisan role, whether it's on the right or on the left. And we don't really have anyone out there anymore that's being a true arbiter of both sides, left and right, holding both sides equally accountable and trying to distill through the partisanship, the spin, to actually get to what's true. And that's a problem for our country. Should we find ourselves in some sort of a national emergency or global crisis, there's got to be somebody out there that can distill what's true, what's not true, and whom do I believe? And with social media, we've actually seen that people don't need the mainstream media anymore.
Wow.
I don't need to get my endorsements or my news through one source because it's the only source out there. I can go get my information online from a variety of different places. And the problem is that there's a lot of folks out there, maybe through intentional act or unintentionally, are passing along information that may be out of context, may not be entirely true, or they're literally just trying to manipulate the information to get their side across. And where, as a former journalist, I'm trained to see through that. I'm trained to recognize it and know where to go to get the facts. A lot of people out there, they're still learning those basics. And so we're going to continue to have this as a problem until I think society and the general public catch up and they realize, here's where I can go to get the truth for myself.
Yeah. And it's interesting with social media pretty much since Twitter, right? Since the President Obama era, we've seen different campaigns trying to interact with social media in different ways. Given your experience with the Trump's campaign in the past, how do you see communication strategies evolving with social media? How are they taking advantage of it? What do you think it's new? What are you seeing that you haven't seen before?
Well, I think one thing social media does, and obviously President Trump was a master at this, is that it gives us the opportunity to get our message directly to the people in their preferred method, meaning on their phone, on their tablet, on their computer, when they want it. And we're no longer trying to just buy television commercials and hoping to hit you because of the type of program or the type of network that we're purchasing, that we're just getting a broad swath of people. That's a good thing, but it's also a bad thing. And that obviously, again, is where you can get some misinformation out there. But ultimately, we've seen this happen before. When I started in this business, it was all about television advertising and maybe the direct mail pieces that we always love to see show up in our mailboxes and we mostly threw away. And then you saw the Obama campaign really use, in 2008, really use email to a great advantage to them. Republicans played catch up. In 2016, we used social media and digital and what we call micro-targeting to very powerful uses and successful uses. Now you see the Democrats catching up to that. So politicians, campaigns are always going to adapt, use the new technology to the best of their advantage. The other side will catch up, then something new will come along, and we'll do the same thing to that.
Yeah. So as we are consumers who are in the media and all that kind of stuff, you mentioned your training as a journalist allows you to kind of see through some of that stuff. What tips would you give to the average person to help them kind of elevate their ability to see through this information?
Well, I think the first thing I would suggest is go find other sources. If you see something that shocks you, amazes you, maybe doesn't sound completely right, or is that true, then go do the research. Don't just hit share. Don't just hit send, but look and see, well, maybe that may not be entirely true. And then go get the other side. And probably what you're going to find out is that there's a kernel of truth to both sides. And the actual truth, the actual fact is probably somewhere in between.
Well, we're in the midst of an intense election. In fact, voting is going to start just in a few days, actually, for this election. And right now, it seems, again, you've got all these polls all over the place, so to speak, and you're kind of trying to lean in. Who can you trust in these kinds of polls? But in your opinion and your experience, what's going to make the difference for either party to really get this over the finish line?
Well, the first thing I would tell you about the polls is I don't believe any of them. And so what I typically do is use one of the polling averages, whether it's the Real Clear Politics average or the 538. There are a number of groups out there that do polling averages. And so when you average a bunch of polls, you can offset for one poll that might be out of whack in terms of their methodology, or they're just what's called an outlier. Secondly, what I would say is, never forget that elections are math problems. They always come down to the math. You have to get 270 electoral votes to win. Most of the electoral votes are already spoken for. This will come down to 7 states, and whoever wins 2 or 3 of, depending on the states and how those combinations go, that's how this is going to play out. And so when I look at where we are currently right now, I think that Donald Trump is ahead of where he was in 2020 in this cycle, because, again, it is a math problem. And he is also ahead where he was compared to where he was in 2020. He's ahead in the battleground states. That puts him over that 270 mark. We still have a long time to go. We have a long way to go. But again, going back to the math problem, here's the question we have to ask ourselves. 2020 came down to 43,000 votes in 3 states. Regardless of what you think of how we got there, any of that, I'm not even going there. 43,000 votes in 3 states. If you actually see one candidate moving the needle, and I mean moving the needle by 1%, 2% with this demographic or that demographic or multiple different demographics, then that election of what, 150 million votes that was actually decided by 43,000 votes? When you say, oh, wait, so-and-so is doing better, 1% better than they were in 2020 in this demographic and 2% better in that demographic, that can be the difference.
Wow.
If those votes are where they are in the key states, that's the difference.
And so what do you think, if you could, I mean, this is a lot of variables, but if you could boil it down to one or two policies that you think is going to make the difference in these battleground states, what do you think those policies are going to be?
James Carville said it famously, the Democrat, in 1992, it's the economy, stupid. And I think it always is. And so people tend to vote with their pocketbooks. And so, you know, if you are Donald Trump, if you are Kamala Harris, you're basically trying to either make the case that you can make things better, you can make things more affordable, or obviously in Trump's case, you can point back to saying, well, it was the last time I was in the White House. And the other issue, I think, is immigration, which definitely ties into crime, but we generalize it as the immigration issue. You know, to put this in perspective, I went back and looked during the Great Migration in the early 1890s until the 1950s, we had 12 million immigrants come into our country through Ellis Island. They signed the book, which was legal. That was the legal immigration at the time. And they came in, they built the great immigrant communities of our nation. In 60 years, 12 million people came in 60 years, and they called it the Great Migration. Kamala Harris and Joe Biden have allowed 12 million illegal immigrants into our country in 3.5 years. The same number of people that came in over 60 have come in the last 3.5, and they didn't sign the book. They haven't had the vetting. And we're now struggling to deal in many communities with what is the result of having 12 million people flood into our country, basically unannounced, and we weren't prepared for.
Wow. Yeah. How big will these debates be? If we have one, we hope we do.
You know, I mean, I think they make great television fodder. I think there's a very small universe out there right now that is truly undecided. And could those make a difference? Yes. I think for the vast majority of the American people, they've already decided where they are, and it's probably 45% one way, 45% the other way, and you're dealing with that last maybe 6, 8, 10%. And how they vote, will it be decided on a debate? Probably not only a debate, but a debate can set a narrative which is reinforced by the campaign through their ads, through their other efforts. And so it's important, but I don't think it's a game changer either way. There have been very few debates that have actually been truly deciding factors, aside from the one back in June.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your insight.
Yeah, wow, great conversation. Grateful that you made time to join us today and give us insight. I know we're doing everything we can on our campus to encourage our students to give voice and to participate, and for them to realize how important it is for civic engagement. And we're working hard in making sure that happens, but grateful for your voice and grateful for your experience and how you're being a part of AFPI. And thank you for joining us today.
Absolutely happy to do so.
Awesome. If you want to stay up to date with Marc, you can follow him on X at Marc_Lotter, Instagram, Facebook at Marc_Lotter, and LinkedIn at Marc Lotter. You can also check out AmericaFirstPolicy.com for news, resources, and updates, everything you need for this critical election season. Thank you so much for listening to Framework Leadership, and we'll see you next time.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you so much for joining us today on Framework Leadership. If you're watching on YouTube, now would be a great time to hit that like button, hit that subscribe button so you can get incredible leadership content right to your YouTube feed. You can also check us out on Spotify and Apple Podcasts every single week, Framework Leadership. And if you love great email newsletters, and I know I do, make sure you check out keningle.com and subscribe to the Framework Leadership newsletter. It's an incredible piece of content we put out every single week of amazing leadership resources right to your inbox inbox. Make sure you check it out. You can also follow us on Instagram at Kent_Ingle, at Dr. Michael Steiner, on X at Kent Ingle, and on Facebook at Kent.Ingle. Stay up to date on all the incredible things happening on the podcast and at Southeastern University. We love you guys, and we love our followers and our subscribers. Thank you so much for listening to the Framework Leadership Podcast.